There is a kind of silence only musicians hear. Stagehands know it too, that split-second hush before the first bow stroke, when the lights burn a little hotter and the world forgets to breathe. For decades, André Rieu has stepped into that silence and turned it into shelter. A waltz, a smile, a gentle swing of the shoulder, and suddenly strangers remember how to be tender with each other. Ask the technicians in Maastricht, and they'll tell you he never wastes an opening night. Ask the paramedics who once waited in the wings, and they'll tell you the same. Joy can be medicine, medicine can be joy. But the body that carries it pays a price. In court-quiet tones, doctors call it an inner ear insult, a neat phrase for a storm that steals balance. To fans, it was simpler. The king of waltz disappeared, then reappeared, a little paler, smiling anyway. To his family, it was a season of handrails and whispered prayers. Marjorie rethreaded schedules like sutures. Pierre watched his father's bow hand tremble, then steady. A granddaughter learned scales in a house where even the walls know music is how you breathe when breath is hard. Investigators of biography love causes and timelines. But some mysteries are simpler and crueler. A man built for melody wakes one morning to a room that won't stop moving. He learns to fight by standing still. He learns the difference between applause and oxygen. So when the lights rise tonight and you see him lift the violin, older, softer, unbroken, know that the bravest note is the first one. If his music has ever kept you standing while your own world tilted, don't look away now. This is the most fragile waltz of his life, and somehow, it's the strongest. Before the posters, before the title King of Waltz hardened into a brand, there was a boy in Maastricht who learned that music could warm a house that felt colder than winter. If historians prefer archives, then let this be the living kind. The voices of those who stood near him when the world tilted, family, crew, doctors, fans stitched together like a waltz in three time. From the family side, Marjorie will tell you the secret architecture of the empire was never glamour. It was planning, flight grids taped to kitchen walls, rehearsal maps pinned beside grocery lists, and 1,000 acts of quiet logistics to protect a performer who refused to cancel unless forced. "We built joy like engineers," she once joked to a friend, because joy collapses without structure. When the inner ear storm first struck, she rebuilt the calendar like a cathedral. Smaller arches, thicker pillars, more room for breath. From the orchestra pit, musicians remember the day the baton paused midair. The stage lights were warm, the audience golden. Then a blink too long, a breath that misfired, a bow that grazed silence. A second violinist later said it felt like catching a crystal before it hit marble. They closed ranks around him without moving an inch, a family disguised as a company. From the clinic, doctors speak in careful phrases. Vestibular dysfunction, labyrinthitis, post-viral sequela, words that sound like locked doors. Translation: the room turns when you don't. Recovery, if it comes, is patient, incremental, unglamorous. Stand, sit, stand again. Artists think in crescendos, one specialist told Pierre. Healing prefers metronomes, and 7 to these levered churned at just true brand. From the media box, commentators narrate the myth, the castle, the Stradivarius violins, 1,667 and 1,732. The summer spectacles at Vrythof Square, where even skeptics leave humming. What their lenses miss is the cost. The ledgers that bled red after cancellations in 2009. The 2020 silence that swallowed revenue and certainty in a single season. The decision tree every night: perform, postpone, protect. From the road crew, there are other truths. A violin case carried like a newborn. A ramp added to a stage no one will notice, except the man who needs it on a bad night. A kettle steaming side stage because warm tea calms a throat that fear has tightened. A paramedic on speed dial who rarely speaks, and when he does, he speaks like a lullaby. From Pierre, there's the guardian's view. He grew up in the shadows of curtains, learned applause is beautiful but not trustworthy, and that the real work begins when the crowd goes home. He times rehearsals to spare his father's balance, trims tours like carefully pruned branches, and measures success in mornings how steady the first 10 steps are. From the audience, from us, there is something more fragile. The widower who came alone and left smiling. The nurse who worked 3 night shifts, stood at the back and cried during the Blue Danube because it felt like a hand on the shoulder. The little girl who watched her grandfather's eyes clear for one song and decided, quietly, to learn the piano. This is the paradox that defines André Rieu, a public life built on private stamina. He never set out to make classical music cool. He set out to make it human, to let cathedrals learn to laugh and arenas remember how to listen. When the body betrayed him, he didn't rewrite his mission. He resized it. Fewer notes, deeper meaning. Smaller radiance, greater warmth. So when we talk about his empire, we are not only talking about wealth or scale, we're talking about a system designed to keep one man upright long enough to keep a promise to thousands. Every show is a negotiation with gravity. Every standing ovation is a receipt for another day endured. And every waltz, no matter how familiar, is a small act of defiance against the oldest enemy, time. Long before the velvet halls and chandeliers, André Léon Marie Nicolas Rieu was just a thin, quiet boy who learned early that love and discipline do not always coexist. He was born on the 1st of October 1949 in Maastricht, a Dutch city still trembling from the aftershocks of war. Its cobblestones carried the memory of soldiers' boots. Its bells rang like old lungs remembering how to breathe. In that hush of recovery, André's childhood unfolded, like a sonata written in minor key, beautiful but cold. His father, André Rieu, Sr., was a conductor, brilliant, distant, absolute. To outsiders, the elder Rieu was a pillar of the city's musical elite. Handsome tuxedos, impeccable timing, orchestras bending to his will. But to his children, he was the law. André would later recall, "My father could move an audience to tears, yet never once hug his son." Inside their tidy brick home, silence ruled louder than any music. His mother, Katharina, managed the household like a metronome, precise, immaculate, joyless. Meals were eaten in orderly quiet, as if sound might stain the porcelain. No laughter, no chaos, no room for childish wonder. Everything was in order, André once said, except the human heart. He was one of 6 children, orbiting around a man who could command thunder from strings, yet refused to see the small universe spinning at his dinner table. While his brothers played sports and his sisters learned manners, André sat alone, conducting imaginary orchestras with a pencil. He dreamed of color in a grayscale world. The boy's rebellion was tenderness, a dangerous thing in a home where emotion was treated like a flaw. There was one night he never forgot. He was 6, sitting by the window, watching snow fall through the lamplight. His father's orchestra played in the next room, rehearsal echoing through the walls. André picked up the family violin, far too big for him, and tried to follow along. The bow scraped, squeaked, then finally found one trembling note that filled the room. His mother appeared in the doorway, candlelight trembling beside her. For a second, she almost smiled. Then the candle died, and the smile went with it. Years later, he described that night as the first time the world listened back. The violin became his companion, not a toy, not even an instrument, but an escape hatch from the airless perfection of his home. When other children played outside, André practiced alone by candlelight. He didn't understand technique, only that the vibrations against his ribs made him feel alive. Pain, he said, was proof that I was real. Neighbors would later say they often heard him through the window, a child playing melodies too sad for his age. He played like someone much older, one woman remembered, like a boy who already knew loss. At 10, he performed at a small church event. The applause was polite, but the look on his father's face was colder than winter. "Music is not for entertainment," the elder Rieu scolded. "It is for reverence." André's small heart cracked a little that night. The applause had felt like sunlight. His father's words turned it to ice. He began to understand that in his home, joy was forbidden fruit. That wound became the hidden engine of his life, the reason he later made whole arenas dance. Each smile from an audience was a rebellion against that childhood silence. When he entered the Royal Conservatory of Brussels in his late teens, André found no refuge there either. The professors measured worth in metronomes, not emotion. They wanted perfect soldiers of sound, he said, but I wanted music that breathed. He practiced until his fingers blistered, yet he often felt invisible. Fellow students mocked his soft-hearted vision of classical music that made people laugh and cry. But one teacher, a quiet violinist named Johannes Esser, saw something others didn't. "You have warmth," Esser told him, "and warmth is dangerous. Keep it. The world will try to cool you down." That single line became André's compass. It was the first adult voice that didn't ask him to harden. He spent evenings wandering the cobblestone alleys of Brussels, Violins slung across his shoulder, busking under yellow streetlights. Passers-by dropped coins, but he cared more for their smiles. He had finally found what his childhood lacked: connection. Every note that echoed through those streets was a rebellion against his upbringing. "I wasn't playing for money," he said. "I was playing to prove that music could still love people." Yet even then, the shadow of his father lingered. Letters from home carried polite updates, never affection. When André announced his intention to form a small ensemble focused on joyful, emotional music, his father wrote one line back: "Do not cheapen the art." That sentence haunted him for years, whispering in the back of his mind before every concert. It was Marjorie, a literature student he met in the 1970 seconds, who began to undo that old wound. "She spoke to me like a melody," André said. "She didn't see a musician. She saw a man who needed permission to feel." Their love became his first real harmony, tender, defiant, and utterly human. His mother disapproved, of course. "Love is not practical," she said. But André had already chosen his song. Every artist has a private origin, myth, and André Rieu's began in that frozen childhood home, a place where silence raised him and sound saved him. The discipline of his parents carved his precision, their coldness forged his warmth, their absence became his calling. He once summarized it best: "I wasn't born in warmth, but I decided to create it." That decision would shape every waltz he ever played, every orchestra he built, and every smile he drew from strangers. What began as a child's search for affection became the world's most joyous rebellion. The boy who played to fill the silence would grow into the man who taught millions that even sorrow can dance. By the late 1970 seconds, André Rieu had transformed from a quiet conservatory student into a man on the verge of mutiny, not against anyone, but against the coldness that had defined music for too long. He'd watched elite halls fill with audiences who clapped politely, then left unchanged. He wanted them to feel again, to laugh, to cry, to forget the boundaries between performer and listener. When he spoke of joy in music, professors smirked. When he spoke of waltzes, critics rolled their eyes. Classical purists considered them frivolous relics of ballroom nostalgia. But André saw something sacred in the waltz, a rhythm that connected people, a heartbeat in three-fourths time. "The waltz," he said, "is not just dance music. It is the sound of people remembering how to be alive." In 1978, at age 29, he gathered a small group of musicians in a modest hall in Maastricht. The floors creaked, the chairs didn't match, and the budget barely covered coffee. Yet that room hummed with belief. They called themselves the Maastricht Salon Orchestra, a gentle rebellion wrapped in smiles and second-hand suits. Marjorie was there too, taking notes, adjusting lights, steadying every fragile plan. She would later say, "We weren't building a career. We were building warmth." At first, the audiences were tiny pensioners, shopkeepers, children clutching flowers. André led the group not with a baton, but with eye contact. He smiled as he played, and soon the musicians smiled back. That smile would become his signature, not a performance trick, but a lifeline. "Music should make people less lonely," he told a journalist years later. "If it doesn't, what's the point?" Still, his father refused to attend a single concert. When André married Marjorie in 1975, the elder Rieu stayed away entirely. The wound was deep but clarifying. "That pain gave me freedom," André said. "I no longer needed permission to be happy." The family's disapproval became the silence he would later drown with violins. The early years were a crucible. Gigs were scarce, bills constant, critics merciless. The orchestra played town squares, retirement homes, local fairs, anywhere that would listen. Some nights, the applause came from a handful of people, yet each note carried conviction. "You can't measure value in volume," he'd tell his players. "If one person leaves smiling, we've succeeded." The turning point came when André realized he didn't just want to play music, he wanted to stage it. He began experimenting with lighting, choreography, and laughter itself. He encouraged audiences to clap along, to stand, to sway behavior once considered unthinkable in classical concerts. For the first time, recalled his violinist friend Paul Harriman, the music felt alive. "We weren't just reading notes, we were speaking to hearts." But joy had a cost. Critics labeled him the pop star of classical. Sponsors pulled back. Grants disappeared. "They told me to grow up," André said. "I told them to dance." To survive, he and Marjorie sold their furniture, moved into a smaller apartment, and used every spare guilder to keep the orchestra alive. One winter, when travel funds ran out, they drove through snowstorms in a borrowed van to reach a church performance. The heater broke halfway there. The musicians played that night in coats and gloves, breath fogging the air, but the music shimmered. A local reporter who attended wrote, "They played like people who had nothing left but hope." By 1987, hope had matured into something sturdier: defiance. André founded the Johann Strauss Orchestra with 12 musicians and an impossible dream to bring joy back to the grand tradition of Viennese waltz. The classical establishment laughed outright. "They called me a sentimental fool," he said, "but I'd rather be sentimental than sterile." He poured everything he owned into the venture. Instruments bought on credit, costumes sewn by friends, posters printed one color at a time. There were weeks when the orchestra's dinner consisted of coffee and bread. But André's belief in joy was contagious. Slowly, the halls filled. People brought their children, their parents, even their grief. The waltz became an act of healing, communal, generous, unpretentious. During those years, a subtle transformation took place. The young man seeking love from an absent father was becoming a father figure himself, not just to his own sons, Pierre and Marc, but to an entire orchestra of dreamers. He treated his players like family, paid them before he paid himself, remembered birthdays, sent flowers to hospital beds. Behind the scenes, he was not a boss but a caretaker. He gave more than he had, one cellist recalled, and somehow it was always enough. But the toll was mounting. Endless rehearsals, sleepless nights, and the constant grind of touring began to erode his health. He ignored the dizziness that came and went, the fatigue that clung like fog. "I thought exhaustion was the price of success," he said later. "I was wrong. It was the warning." Still, he refused to stop. In 1988, his small orchestra performed its first major concert. The applause was thunderous. Backstage, André wept silently. His father had died the year before, never having seen a single performance. It was both victory and heartbreak, the closure of one life, the ignition of another. "I played that night for him," he whispered, "and for the boy he never saw." And the Than her Bug Prevens Sodding. That performance marked the true birth of the André Rieu the world knows today, a man who made classical music breathe again, who believed beauty must be shared, and who carried inside him a wound that turned to melody. His early career was not paved with opportunity, but with rejection that refined his vision. Every no from critics became another note in his symphony of survival. And when the world finally began to listen, it didn't just hear music, it heard the sound of someone who refused to let pain win. By the early 1990 seconds, André Rieu's quiet rebellion had erupted into something the classical world hadn't seen in decades: emotion unrestrained. His concerts were no longer polite evenings of culture. They were living celebrations where tuxedos clapped, grandmothers danced, and strangers wept together beneath chandeliers. The critics who once sneered now scrambled for interviews. The world was finally learning to dance again, and its rhythm pulsed from Maastricht. The pivotal moment arrived in 1995, a night etched into European television history. Rieu's performance of Shostakovich's Waltz No. 2 during the UEFA Champions League drew tens of thousands into silence, then roaring applause. It wasn't just a song, it was a spell. The next morning, his records sold out across the continent. Within weeks, he was on every talk show, his orchestra booked months in advance. "That night," he said later, "I felt the world turning toward joy again." But behind the triumph, there was exhaustion, a truth few noticed under the glitter. Crew members recall him sleeping on the floor of a tour bus, violin case as a pillow, whispering notes into his recorder even in half-dream. He worked like a man running from silence, one stage manager remembered. If the music stopped, you could feel his fear. Rieu's rise was not orchestrated by a corporate empire. It was handmade, every contract, every rehearsal, every costume overseen by Marjorie. She balanced books while raising their sons, turning their modest home office into a command center for one of the fastest-growing independent musical acts in the world. "He was the dream," she later said, "but someone had to keep the dream awake." By the late 1990 seconds, the Johann Strauss Orchestra had expanded from 12 players to nearly 80. Each concert grew into a theatrical spectacle. Open-air plazas bathed in golden light, fountains dancing in sync with violins, fireworks illuminating audiences that stretched beyond the horizon. Journalists called it a fairy tale revival of old Europe. But the truth was simpler. André had discovered the science of joy. Every show was crafted to build and release emotion like a heartbeat. Every encore was a shared breath between artist and crowd. From the audience, the experience bordered on spiritual. One London critic confessed, "It's impossible to remain cynical in his presence. You enter skeptical and leave changed." In Vienna, an elderly couple renewed their vows mid-concert while the orchestra played The Beautiful Blue Danube. In Melbourne, 10,000 people swayed in unison to My Way. Even those who mocked his style secretly admitted it. The man had turned happiness into high art. But fame has gravity, and the higher he climbed, the heavier the crown became. By 2000, Rieu's name was synonymous with cultural diplomacy, a Dutch ambassador of beauty. Governments invited him to perform at summits, royals requested private shows, and yet he continued to insist, "I am not important. The music is." Financially, the empire he built was staggering. Tours sold out months ahead. Albums topped charts in 20 countries. He invested his fortune back into the music, creating his own studio in Maastricht, his own production company, even a fleet of trucks to transport instruments, costumes, and stage sets across Europe. Each concert was a logistical ballet. Over 100 staff members, 30 vehicles, and a mountain of sound equipment. André refused sponsorships that dictated his art. "If I take their money, I play their song," he once said. "I prefer to play mine." That independence was both his triumph and his torment. Every risk, every debt, every sleepless night, it was all his responsibility. Still, the rewards were sublime. He became a cultural phenomenon, not through rebellion, but through tenderness. While pop idols courted shock, Rieu courted sincerity. He'd pause mid-performance to tell stories about his parents, his first violin, or the loneliness of touring. He'd laugh at mistakes, bow to his musicians, and wave at children in the crowd. The line between stage and life dissolved. He wasn't performing to people. He was performing with them. The global press called him the man who resurrected emotion. But Marjorie knew the cost. He would return from concerts, pale, dizzy, sometimes trembling. The same balance disorder that had haunted him since the 1,980 seconds was quietly worsening. Yet he refused to slow down. "People wait their whole lives to feel something real," he told her once. "I can't take that away from them." Between 2003 and 2008, André Rieu's concerts expanded to North America, Asia, and Australia, transforming him into a worldwide icon. His open-air Vrijthof concerts became pilgrimage sites for fans, drawing tourists from every continent. The orchestras of old Europe had kept waltzes locked behind velvet doors. Rieu threw them open to the streets. "Music," he said, "is not a museum piece. It's a living body. It must move." He earned millions and spent them all to make the next show even grander. More violins, more flowers, more light. His team began calling him the perfectionist of feeling. He wanted every concert to feel like the last sunset on Earth, one lighting designer said. Then came 2009. In the middle of another massive tour, his body finally revolted. Vertigo struck without warning, sudden dizziness, nausea, the sensation of the ground slipping away. Dozens of shows had to be canceled. Fans were heartbroken. Tabloids speculated wildly. Some whispered that the King of Waltz was finished. But those who knew him, the crew, the family, the doctors, tell a different story. He didn't stop. He just paused long enough to survive. Even in recovery, André's perfectionism wouldn't rest. He reorganized the entire business from bed. He paid every employee's salary out of pocket. "I wasn't sleeping," he said. "I was calculating not profit, but how to save everyone." When he returned to the stage months later, the applause was deafening. But the performance was slower, gentler, a man playing, not to impress, but to endure. That tour became legend. Fans said they could feel his fragility in every note. It was the moment André Rieu crossed from entertainer to something else, a living metaphor for resilience. By his 60 seconds, his empire spanned continents. His concerts were televised in more than 100 countries. His castle in Maastricht, once a dream, became both home and sanctuary. There he practiced alone in the early mornings, the violin trembling softly in candlelight. It was no longer about mastery, it was about grace. "Each day I can still play," he said, "is already a concert." And yet, even at the peak, there was melancholy in his smile. the awareness that applause fades, but legacy lingers. Fame had given him the world, but it had also taken his balance, his rest, his anonymity. Still, he accepted it with a serenity that only survivors know. The waltz, he once whispered backstage, is a circle. You always return to where you began. André Rieu had finally found what he sought since boyhood, a world warmed by music. But the higher he lifted others, the more fragile his own footing became. What the public saw as triumph was, in truth, the beginning of his quiet descent. By the end of the 2000s, André Rieu's empire gleamed like a fairy tale kingdom: orchestras, castles, fleets of trucks crossing Europe under banners of gold. To the world, he seemed untouchable. But beneath the grandeur, his body and mind had been writing a different symphony, one of exhaustion, vertigo, and the quiet terror that the very rhythm he had built his life upon was starting to betray him. It began, as many tragedies do, not with collapse but with dizziness. In 2010, during a rehearsal in Germany, the ground shifted beneath his feet, not metaphorically, literally. The stage blurred, the lights swayed, the world spun like a carousel gone wrong. He gripped his violin stand to stay upright. Musicians froze, unsure whether it was part of the performance. It wasn't. Within minutes, the concert was canceled. Doctors called it a viral infection of the inner ear, a cruel assault on the very sense that gave him his livelihood. The word balance became both diagnosis and metaphor. To outsiders, it was a temporary setback. To André, it was a haunting. It felt like gravity had turned against me, he said later, as if the earth no longer wanted me to dance. For months, he lived inside a spinning world. He couldn't walk without holding walls. His trusted violin, once an extension of his body, became too heavy to lift. There were days when sound itself hurt. And yet, even in that silence, the orchestra kept calling. The staff still needed salaries, the shows still had tickets sold, and fans still wrote letters that began with, "Dear Maestro, please come back soon." From the outside, this looked like success interrupted. From within, it was something closer to drowning. Marjorie became nurse, manager, and guardian angel. She canceled tours quietly, rewrote contracts, and faced a wall of angry promoters alone. He couldn't bear to disappoint people, she later said, so I took the blame. I told them it was me. The family shielded him from headlines, but behind the doors of the Maastricht castle, the truth was brutal. André would practice standing for 5 minutes, then collapse onto the floor, trembling with vertigo. He described it as playing inside a hurricane. His son Pierre watched helplessly. He built this empire with his hands, Pierre said, and suddenly those hands were shaking. It took over a year for him to return. The comeback concert was cautious, slower tempos, longer pauses between pieces. But when the first bow stroke touched the strings, the audience rose. They knew. They could feel the fragility behind the music. For the first time, the King of Waltz wasn't a symbol of perfection. He was a symbol of survival. Yet tragedy, like rhythm, has a way of repeating. In 2016, his oldest friend and trombonist, Ruud Merckx, collapsed unexpectedly mid-tour. One moment laughter, in the dressing room the next, an unthinkable silence. André finished that night's concert, but the light had gone from his eyes. It was like losing a limb, he confessed later. I still turn on stage expecting to see him there. Since that day, he leaves a few silent bars in every performance, an invisible tribute only his orchestra understands. For the audience, the magic continued. But behind the smiles, there was a cost that could not be counted in applause. His vertigo returned intermittently, a ghost that visited unannounced. Sometimes during rehearsal, he'd grip a chair, eyes closed, breathing through the dizziness until it passed. Once, a stagehand found him in the corridor before a show, trembling. "I'll be fine," André whispered. "The music will hold me." And somehow, it always did. Then came the pandemic of 2020, and for the first time in over half a century, the world went silent. No concerts, no rehearsals, no laughter from the crowds of Maastricht. For a man who had built his existence on shared sound, the quiet was suffocating. Yet André's first thought wasn't for himself. It was for his people, the 100 musicians, technicians, drivers, and tailors who depended on his empire to survive. While other artists froze operations, André kept paying salaries out of his own reserves. The castle that had once been his sanctuary became a fortress of spreadsheets, calls, and mounting losses. He sold old cars, liquidated assets, and considered in a moment that broke him selling one of his 1,732 Stradivarius violins. He never did, but the thought itself left him shaken. It would have been like selling my soul, he admitted. He began to write again during those empty months, slower, quieter music. Songs for small rooms, for empty chairs, for the ghosts of applause. When the world went silent, he said, I learned that music doesn't live in crowds, it lives in breath. By the time stages reopened, André was changed. The concerts were smaller, the gestures gentler, the smiles softer. Each performance felt like a prayer of gratitude. The empire still stood, but it no longer looked like victory, it looked like endurance. Fans sensed it. Audiences wept openly. It wasn't just a show, one woman said after his return in 2021. It was like watching someone win their life back, that the lust would brought it. But fate was not done testing him. In 2024, during a concert in Mexico, the lights brightened, the crowd cheered, and suddenly he faltered. The bow slipped, the world tilted, and he collapsed mid-stage. Thousands watched in horror as medics rushed forward. For a man who had spent decades defying gravity, it was the most tragic image imaginable, the king of waltz, felled by the very motion he once mastered. He awoke in a hospital hours later, the ceiling spinning above him. I thought it was over, he whispered. But I heard music faint, distant, and I realized I was still here. Recovery was slow and humbling. For weeks, he couldn't stand unaided. Doctors warned that another episode might be irreversible. But when asked if he'd retire, he smiled weakly. How do you retire from breathing? To his family's dismay, he returned once more. I can't stop, he told Pierre. People need to see that you can fall and still stand again. He began performing, seated for rehearsals, gradually regaining balance through sheer will. Every concert afterward became a negotiation between body and spirit, the music steady, the man behind it trembling but unbowed. By 2025, the myth of André Rieu had deepened. Fans didn't just see a performer anymore, they saw resilience incarnate. The critics who once mocked his sentimentality now called him the last romantic warrior. And yet, behind the legend remained a frail man in his mid-70 seconds, waking each morning to test whether the ground still held steady beneath him. He once said, I was born into silence and spent my life teaching the world to sing. Maybe that's why silence keeps coming for me to see if I'll sing again. And every time, somehow, he does. In November 2025, André Rieu's mornings begin quietly, not with applause, but with the soft sound of birds threading through the mist around his 150-year-old home near his beloved castle in Maastricht. The same castle that once symbolized ambition has become a place of restoration. The grandeur remains, the glass conservatory glowing at sunrise. The gardens heavy with dew, but now it hums with something gentler. Gratitude. The rhythm of his life has slowed to an intimate tempo. At dawn, he walks the garden paths with a trainer at his side, steps measured, cautious, but defiant. Every step, he says, is its own concert. Breakfast is herbal tea, a few slices of fruit, vitamins for balance. No champagne, no indulgence, just quiet discipline. His doctors have built a schedule around his fragile equilibrium. Limited travel, reduced performances, long recovery windows. It's a far cry from the jet-set whirlwind of his peak years, but André doesn't mourn the change. The silence I once feared, he told a Dutch interviewer this spring, has become my teacher. In the afternoons, he retreats to his studio, the same one he built in the castle decades ago. Sometimes he practices for hours, sometimes for minutes. Some days he only sits there, fingers resting on the violin, as though conversing with an old friend. On others, he composes slow waltzes, almost lullabies, written not for crowds but for himself. His playing now carries a fragility that even he acknowledges. When you've faced losing music, he says, you stop chasing perfection, you start chasing peace. From the courtyard, laughter drifts in Marjorie, his wife of 50 years, still the unwavering force behind his serenity. She handles correspondence, production details, and schedules, shielding him from the noise of commerce. Insiders call her the hidden conductor. André calls her the reason the music still exists. She saved my life more times than medicine, he says. When I forgot who I was, she remembered. Their son Pierre, now a father himself, manages nearly every facet of the Rieu empire. He is both gatekeeper and protector, organizing tours, negotiating with promoters, ensuring every performance aligns with his father's health limits. My job, he told a journalist, is to make sure the music survives the man. Behind that practical tone lies devotion. The same quiet loyalty André once showed to his own musicians. Then there is Daisy, his granddaughter, the light that cuts through the weight of legacy. She plays piano with a curiosity that reminds André of his 6-year-old self, bow trembling in cold hands decades ago. He listens to her in the evenings, smiling through tears. She plays with joy I never had as a child, he confides. It means the music has learned to forgive. Daisy's laughter now fills the spaces that once echoed with discipline. The house that raised a lonely boy has finally learned warmth. Though his net worth now exceeds $600 million, André's true fortune is measured differently. He has built homes for staff members, funded music schools, and quietly supports hospitals in Maastricht. Money, he says, is only meaningful when it builds something that sings. He no longer tours as widely, performing just a few select shows each year, intimate, candlelit, filled with nostalgia. Every concert ends the same way. A long pause, a breath, and then the whisper to the orchestra, "Let's waltz one more time." For those who see him backstage, the rituals remain. The rosin bow, the soft hum before the first note, the photograph of Ruud Merckx, taped to his violin case, a tiny act of remembrance before every performance. He knows the curtain will one day fall. His hearing has softened, his balance remains uncertain, and his strength ebbs more quickly now. Yet he greets each day like an encore. "When I play," he says, "I feel the child in me still asking for love, and finally, the world answers." André Rieu's later years are not a decline, but a gentle decrescendo, the sound of a life easing towards silence with dignity, gratitude, and grace. The man who once built an empire to escape loneliness now spends his days surrounded by family, music, and the quiet proof that even the most fragile melodies can endure. The name André Rieu is now written not only in the annals of music, but in the soft pulse of millions of hearts that found solace in his waltzes. His legacy is a paradox, grand and humble, extravagant and deeply human. The critics once mocked him for turning classical music into spectacle, but history, as it often does, has rewritten the verdict. In the decades since his rise, entire generations have grown up associating violins not with stiffness, but with emotion. Conservatories that once forbade smiling on stage now teach audience connection as a core performance skill. A revolution quietly born from one man's insistence that joy is not trivial. "He made beauty democratic," said a BBC interviewer in 2023. "He gave the violin back to ordinary people." Ask musicians in his orchestra what his real legacy is, and they won't mention money or fame. They'll talk about how he paid salaries from his own pocket during the pandemic, how he insisted every player eat before he did, how he built housing for staff families so their children could grow up near music. One violinist described him best. "He didn't just conduct, he cared." From Maastricht to Melbourne, Rieu's concerts became something larger than entertainment. They became collective therapy. People came not just to listen, but to remember the parts of themselves that the world had worn down. Psychologists have studied his performances for their emotional resonance, calling them orchestrated empathy. To sit in a Rieu audience was to feel for a few hours that grief could dance and pain could be sung back into harmony. Cultural historians now speak of the Rieu effect, the rebirth of live orchestral spectacle in the 21st century. Before him, classical crossover was a niche curiosity. After him, it became a movement. His concerts at the Vrijthof Square are broadcast to millions worldwide, transforming an ancient European plaza into a global living room each summer. Cities that once saw classical music as elitist began to invest again in orchestras, outdoor festivals, and arts education, ripple effects of one man's belief that happiness deserved a stage. His castle in Maastricht, once a symbol of ambition, has become a cultural landmark, part home, part museum, part sanctuary. Visitors who tour it describe the strange calm of its rooms. The 18th century instruments displayed like sacred relics, the faint echo of strings drifting from hidden speakers, and photographs of audiences from every corner of the world. Near the grand staircase, a plaque reads simply, "Joy must be shared or it dies." In academic circles, Rieu remains a subject of debate. Purists still call his work sentimental populism, while others argue he rescued classical music from extinction. But even his harshest critics concede the evidence. Ticket sales in hundreds of cities, orchestral attendance rising wherever he tours, and an entire generation of young musicians who cite him as their gateway to classical art. The King of Waltz has also become, unintentionally, a philosopher of resilience. His interviews over the last decade reveal a deep awareness of fragility of art, of the body, of life itself. "I am not a genius," he often says. "I am just someone who refused to stop playing." That humility has become part of his myth. In a world that prizes irony, André Rieu dared to be sincere. In an age obsessed with novelty, he made repetition holy. And in a culture numbed by noise, he reminded people that sound could still heal. His concerts may glitter, but his truest work happens in the quiet, the thousands of small reconciliations between music and emotion, between audience and self. Even now, when fans watch his later performances, they sense the ghosts, the absent father, the lost friend, the dizzying silence he once fought through. Yet the miracle of Ryu's art is that he never hides the cracks. He plays through them. "Perfection," he once said, "is boring. Emotion is eternal." His legacy isn't about wealth or even survival. It's about endurance, the courage to turn a wound into a waltz and share it with the world. Future generations may forget the numbers, the castles, the gold-plated violins, but they will remember the feeling that for a few minutes under a summer sky, life itself swayed in rhythm, and nobody felt alone. There's a strange tenderness in the way André Rieu divides people. To some, he's a sentimental showman, a man who gilded classical music in smiles and sequins. To others, he's a healer who turned loneliness into beauty. Here, between admiration and misunderstanding, lies the true fascination of his story. At Celebrity Forgotten, we have traced countless lives, actors who burned too fast, musicians devoured by fame, stars who vanished under their own brilliance. Yet few have carried both light and fragility so openly as André Rieu. His tragedy was never scandal. It was sincerity, the rarest and most punished quality in an industry built on masks. Rieu never pretended to be revolutionary. He simply refused to be cold. He wasn't trying to modernize Mozart or remix Strauss. He was trying to remind us that music, like love, must be felt before it is understood. Critics mocked his smiles, his twirling dresses, the grand romanticism of it all. But those who stood in his crowds, the widows, the children, the dreamers, knew exactly what he was doing. He was giving them permission to feel. Behind every glittering stage there was, as we've seen, another reality. Sleepless nights, illness, the quiet terror of a spinning world. That duality, triumph above, turmoil below, defines nearly every legend we've ever studied. Fame lifts the artist, but hollows the man. For Rieu, the applause that once fueled him became a test of endurance. His heart was enormous, but so was the weight of keeping joy alive for millions. And yet he never retreated into cynicism. That might be his most radical act of all. What moves us most isn't his success. It's the stubborn kindness that survives success. Even after losing balance, friends, health, and time itself, he never weaponized pain into bitterness. "The world is heavy," he once said, "so I play to make it lighter." There's something defiant in that gentleness that refuses extinction. It's easy to measure a life in wealth, views, or followers. But André Rieu's worth is felt in quieter currencies, in the hands that stop shaking long enough to applaud, in the faces that find joy where none remained. The waltz, once mocked as trivial, became his act of resistance, a circle of grace that kept spinning even when the ground beneath him shifted. If you strip away the gold and chandeliers, what remains is a man who played his way through silence, the kind of silence that destroys lesser souls. And maybe that's why his story lingers. Because beneath all the spectacle, André Rieu reminds us of a truth every artist knows but few admit, that creation is not about being seen. It's about surviving. He built his empire not on genius but on empathy, a currency too rare to counterfeit. His concerts may glitter, but their power comes from something ancient and invisible, the pulse of human fragility set to rhythm. So as we look back at his 76 years, the dizzying heights, the literal falls, the tears and laughter braided into every bowstroke, we see not a man clinging to youth, but one learning to age without surrender. That's the real music, the one hidden beneath the notes. And if his story feels personal, that's because it is. Whether you've faced silence, illness, or loss, you've already lived your own version of his waltz. The rhythm may falter, but the melody, that soft insistence to keep going, never truly stops. There is a moment near the end of every André Rieu concert that feels like time itself holds its breath. The violins slow, the lights dim to a golden hush, and for a heartbeat the world forgets to move. You can almost hear his life folded into those final notes. The lonely boy from Maastricht, the dreamer defying silence, the old man still searching for balance in a world that keeps spinning. When the music fades, there is no triumph, only tenderness. He lowers the violin and smiles the same way he did 50 years ago. A little tired, a little shy, as if surprised that the world still listens. Behind him, the orchestra exhales in relief. In the front row, a child holds her grandmother's hand, both swaying softly. For them, this isn't a concert. It's memory made visible. In that hush, you begin to understand why André's story haunts so many. It isn't because of fame or fortune. It's because his life is proof that beauty and suffering share the same rhythm. That love, real love, often arrives disguised as endurance. He turned pain into melody, exhaustion into faith, and fragility into something luminous. Those who knew him well say he never really believed in immortality. Nothing lasts, he once said, except the feeling. Perhaps that's the secret of his longevity. He never chased eternity. He simply tried to make every moment sing. And somehow, that made him eternal anyway. Now, in the quiet years of his life, his waltzes echo differently. They sound like letters to time, gentle, grateful, unfinished. His concerts may one day stop, but the music has already escaped him. It lives in wedding halls, in nursing homes, in headphones on lonely commutes. Every place where someone needs to be reminded that life, despite everything, is still beautiful. As the curtain falls, you sense that the story isn't over. Not really. Because every listener carries a piece of it now, the warmth, the courage, the fragile defiance. André Rieu's journey is no longer just his own. It's ours too. The endless attempt to stand, to breathe, to keep the rhythm when the ground shifts beneath our feet. Some stories end in silence. This one ends in resonance, a faint, eternal hum between sorrow and joy. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now, you know,